welcome everyone to another edition of the NatCon Australia podcast. Today, I'm delighted to welcome British academic Kit Kowol. Kit is an historian who received his PhD in politics from Oxford University in 2014 and subsequently taught there and at King's College London. He's now based in Brisbane. Last month, he released a book called Blue Jerusalem, British Conservatism, Winston Churchill and the Second World War, published by Oxford University Press. Welcome, Kit.
Thanks. Lovely to see you, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Great stuff. Now, World War II is an inherently interesting topic. It's a hinge point of history. It defines still in many ways the world we live in today. But it also is a controversial one, and still in some respects. There was a recent podcast with Tucker Carlson where he interviewed an amateur historian, I think by the name of Darryl Cooper, and he made some claims about Winston Churchill and how Britain got into the Second World War and its conduct there, which then prompted a response by big name historians like Neil Ferguson and Victor Davis Hanson. Your book is a revisionist work in some respect, although I don't think. Well, who knows? I don't think we'll prompt those guys to jump in and jump on you, which seeks to upend some of the myths that we have about that conflict and its aftermath. But before we jump into those, I thought it'd be worth, in order to sort of set the scene for those who need reminding about some aspects of British history, setting this historical scene. Your book's called Blue Jerusalem, which obviously takes its is inspired in some ways from the New Jerusalem, which is famously associated with the program of the British Labour Party, which took office in the United Kingdom in 1945. And my initial question is, so why was Winston Churchill, war hero, and his party thrown out of office in such a huge landslide only 3 months after the war, after defeating Nazi Germany in Europe?
Okay, thanks. So, start with the easy ones. So this is in many ways kind of the great question. And it's interesting, we're starting to talk about conservatism. The book is all about conservatism during the Second World War. And we're starting where the war ends rather than where it begins. And I think that tells you a lot about why this subject hasn't really been touched on very much. Because of the way that it all goes wrong in 1945, there's been a tendency to think that not a lot was going on beforehand, and to kind of read into the results an analysis of how British politics operated during the war. That being said, so why did the Conservative Party lose the war? Sorry, why did they lose the election? In many ways, they win the war, is what I argue. So why did they lose the election? Well, there's 3 reasons. So the first is, the easiest to understand. It's an organizational one. So the Conservative Party have been historically in Britain up until this point absolutely at the forefront of all kind of electioneering, campaigning technology. They're the people who do things like have cinema displays, have people that go paid canvassers to go around knocking on people's doors, and they're a huge kind of social organization as well as a political organization. You're thinking in kind of rural Britain, you haven't got a lot necessarily going on. There's no kind of cinemas or theatres to go to. You might go to instead a fete at the Conservative Party Association, or maybe a kind of a dance or something like that. So they're hugely advanced in terms of their electioneering. But during the war, they stop dead when the war kicks off in 1939.
Well, because there were also, just for an Australian audience, there was no election from 1935 until 1945, which is different to what happened here, and it's also different to what happened to the United States. So essentially, the Conservatives, in ultimately a national government with Labor and some Liberals too, I think, had been in power for at least 10 years and earlier, before we get to 1945.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So what happens? They stop doing their campaigning, and they don't do this out of any it's partly out of noble moves, but it's also a political maneuver. because they want to look patriotic. That's the idea. We're going to stop campaigning. Labour will carry on doing, and the Liberals will do their thing, and we'll show them that they're just doing politics and we care about the nation. So that's one of the reasons, and it ties into the other main reason for why the Conservatives lost the election, is that the Conservatives in Britain, up until that point, had been very, very good at painting the Labour Party as a sectional party, the party of the workers, the party of the trade unions, and presenting them instead themselves, the Tories, as the party of the nation, the patriotic party, the party that cared about everyone and not just a slice of the population. And that argument is very, very powerful and persuasive for much of the interwar period, but it comes up against the fact that actually during the Second World War, they can't argue that any longer, because in 1940, the Labour Party gets into government. Clement Attlee's standing shoulder to shoulder with Winston Churchill. In many ways, they wouldn't have been there. Churchill wouldn't have been there if it hadn't been for the Labour Party. So you can't damn Labour like you used to. And the final reason is that really to do with the fact that 1945 is an election where people want things. Enormous conflict, and people have come out of it, and Britain is a hungry country. It is a country that's also kind of desperately short of housing. There are worries about what jobs they're going to be after the Second World War. And the Conservatives are frankly not really trusted to deliver the goods, because the narrative has developed over the course of the war that the Conservative kind of betrayed the country after the Great Depression, and they didn't have the ideas and the organisation for the post-war world. And actually, you should trust Labour. They're the people who can use the power of the wartime state to do all those things and organise the country in peace as they did in war. So those are the three reasons why I think the Conservatives lose in 1945.
Yeah, it's just such a huge landslide against them. It's not sort of. I think it was like 8 or 9% swing, which is that still one of the biggest landslides in British history?
Yeah, and I mean, until Rishi Sunak's in many ways, it was the absolute nadir of Tory fortunes then in 1997. But yeah, 2024 really eclipses them all.
Yeah, right. Okay. I mean, was Winston Churchill as popular towards the end of the war as he was in the days of the Blitz and Dunkirk and that? I mean, it just seems difficult to believe that you get that much of a landslide if you still had an incredibly popular leader of the party.
Well, I mean, that's a great question. It's one of the things that historians debate all the time. What's certainly the case is that there is a sense that Churchill, people can appreciate Churchill for being a fantastic war leader. And I think there is, I've spent a lot of time looking at the letters written to Churchill after his defeat. And even Labour Party members and MPs and activists will write to Churchill and say, look, you did a wonderful job in the war. We'll never forget you. You're a fantastic Briton. But we just didn't think you were right in times of peace. And you actually see this on the campaign trail. He goes on this kind of great tour around the country. And everyone, his advisors think, right, you've got this popularity. This is what's going to kind of carry us over the line. And you find he's getting booed and jeered and stuff because he seemed to be the old man, a representative of an old time, rather than the kind of bright future that Labour and the Socialists are, purportedly going to bring.
Yeah, and so, and I assume there weren't, detailed preferred leader polls like we have today, where you can track their standing over the years. They simply wouldn't have done them during the wartime period, right?
I mean, there is polling that's done. It's not. I think what's interesting is it's not taken desperately seriously, and that's one of the reasons why it's a terrible shock. Because most politicians in that period thought that they had a kind of better handle on the population than what some kind of clipboard carrying chap kind of wandering around taking a survey did. But yeah, his popularity does sort of start to decline in from about 1942 onwards, when people start, the war's not won, but we can kind of see which direction it's going, and there's more talk about the future. And Churchill's seen, wrongly, I think, to be associated with ideas of the past.
So it wasn't so much that anger at the Tories, like the Rishi Sunak election. It was more that they were persuaded that the Labour Party, with its new manifesto and its optimistic plans for the future, was a better option. And they had admittedly proven, or at least could make a claim, that we are responsible, patriotic people. We've served in government, in the national government with Churchill, and even if you like him or don't like him, we are certainly capable of running the country in the post-war period.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair assessment. I mean, it used to be the case, and it's part of Labour's mythology, that there's this huge kind of groundswell of desire for socialism in 1945, and it's that which pushes Labour over the line. But I think historians are now much more cautious about this, and it's more, people are really concerned about day-to-day things, and it's a sense that Labour is better placed to deliver things like better workplace insurance against unemployment, better healthcare, better food than the Tories, rather than a kind of desire for this kind of new world that they're purporting to bring.
Yeah, I mean, there was a global wave. You had FDR in the States. You had the Labour Party in power in Australia by that stage. And so it's, in some ways, it's natural that the other Anglosphere country would, follow the same lead too. What your book spends a lot of time talking about and analyzing in great depth a lot of the political schools of thought that were competing in the Conservative Party or in conservative circles about, well, how to prosecute the war, but also the what a post-war future for Britain would look like. If the Conservatives had won in 1945, how would things have looked different?
I mean, that's a fantastic question. I think that they would have looked quite different. Again, this is one of the kind of big kind of schools of thought that we've had in particularly UK history for a long time, is this idea that there was a consensus between Labour and the Tories, that really, though they differed on some respects, particularly around things like nationalisation, actually they were pretty much agreed in terms of things like increasing the size of the welfare state and turning empire into commonwealth. I think we have to be cautious with that, and realize that, Conservatives had their own plans. So I think one of the most striking things about it is I think that Conservatives probably would have been much, much more skeptical about the economic arrangements that the Labour Party kind of accept that are kind of in many ways forced upon Britain from the United States. So I think in terms of Britain's trading arrangements and the valuation of the pound and various other things to do with kind of what was then known as the sterling area. And there was a big kind of groundswell of conservative opinion kind of against that sort of stuff. What we think of today as kind of what was called Bretton Woods system, but also kind of what we know today as the World Trade Organization, before that, GATT. And Conservatives were very skeptical about this during the war, saw it as an attempt, as one of them called, to kind of create an American economic Lebensraum. So I think you would have seen a much tougher fight against that, and a kind of conservative attempt to kind of really build up the empire much more strongly as an economic unit than perhaps Labour did. Not that Labour were kind of the anti-imperialists that many in the party, Labour Party today, are. They had their own kind of imperial forays, but that, I think, unsung anti-Americanism, which is a big part of World War II conservatism, probably would have been much more pronounced after the war. And, God only knows what kind of world we could have had as a result of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated in the UK, at least for an Australian audience who may not be as familiar, because there were three parties. There was the Liberal Party, there was the Conservatives, and there was the Labor Party. And Churchill, started off as he started off as a conservative, and then he moved to the Liberals, and he was part of the big Liberal landslide. I mean, if nothing else, he certainly picked which side was going to be in power. So he had good political judgment that way. But the reason why I mention it is because that
Mm.
first Liberal government also introduced lots of welfare programs too. And so isn't it at least conceivable that, you just would have seen the same type of programs rolled out, albeit on at least on the welfare side, albeit in a slower way?
I think possibly in a slower way. I mean, Conservatives were, the great kind of plan for the post-war British welfare state is called the Beveridge Plan,
Yeah.
and Conservatives were in many ways in favour of what was at times quite a conservative, small c conservative plan, which is all about maintaining the family, personal responsibility.
Beveridge was a
Um,
liberal too. He wasn't actually from the Labor side, so he was in that
yeah,
tradition of
yeah,
the new liberals or whatever that came from Lloyd George and
yeah,
Churchill himself.
and absolutely, and I think it's very easy to imagine that the welfare state in Britain suddenly emerges after the Second World War.
Mm.
It's very much not the case, as you kind of highlight. It's got a long kind of liberal antecedent, but it's also, the Conservatives were very involved in developing the welfare state, a particular type of welfare state during the interwar period, one that's much less universalist, much more targeted,
Mm.
um, much less statist in some ways than what emerges afterwards. I mean, one of the things that has fascinated me since kind of moving to Australia is I can very much see Britain having a healthcare system much more like an Australian system after the Second World War, where there's kind of government support, but also privately operating hospitals, rather than kind of one massive national body. And that's the kind of approach that Conservatives were talking about during the Second World War, very different to what we end up with.
Yeah, there is this reverence for the NHS, born of that period when it was introduced after the Second World War, which doesn't quite exist in the same way for our public healthcare system here. Um, I just can't quite imagine Medicare featuring in an Olympics opening ceremony like it was
No.
in the UK. Not to say it doesn't have a lot of problems here too, but I guess that's what you're getting at in this book. Really, is trying to puncture some of those big myths, which created this almost sort of, well, you know, quasi spiritual type of attachment to these institutions that were established post World War II.
Yeah, I mean, definitely myth puncturing. I think the big myth is this puncturing this idea that this is the only way it could have been.
Mm.
That Britain was always destined to have something that looked like the National Health Service, or our National Health Service, as
Mm.
it's always referred to these days in the UK, or
Mm.
that Britain was destined to have a mixed market economy, where there was a state and private, or Britain was destined to have almost be engaged in the Cold War on the same side as the United States.
Mm.
Things can change. The Second World War was one of these kind of great kind of inflection points, and an election really, really made a difference. Elections matter. I think that's one of the things that really comes out of the book.
Yeah, let's jump into that then, that period, because there's a fascinating chapter on a fascinating, which is dominated by a fascinating guy called Lord Beaverbrook. Maybe
Mm.
maybe explain to people who he was, and why he was significant.
Okay, so Beaverbrook is, I mean, he's an almost cartoonish character. He's brilliant. He is a Canadian. He is a millionaire by the time he's 21 or something like that.
Mm.
Hugely successful. He's a newspaper man, and he has what he moves to the UK and becomes an MP, becomes great friends with Winston Churchill, buys up a newspaper and sort of turns it into his kind of own mouthpiece. And he's usually kind of seen as, you know, just one of kind of Churchill's cronies, really. And you know, perhaps if he's interested in anything, he's interested in his own career and becoming prime minister, perhaps. And I kind of argue that there's something different going on. That Beaverbrook is someone who has what I kind of term a kind of split imperial personality. He's someone who's Canadian on one hand, and sort of British on the other, and he kind of tries to unite these kind of elements of his personality through this idea of the British Empire. And he really thinks that the British Empire is this fantastic organization, fantastic economic organization, and he wants to turn what is before the Second World War. It's linked, but it's not like the European Union of today, or you know, even necessarily a NAFTA. He really wants to unite the empire economically, and he sees that as a way in which to balance against kind of other powers. And he's quite open about seeing America as a you know, a potential rival, in contrast to kind of Churchill, kind of half American, who's much more sympathetic to this idea of like a shared Anglo-Saxon race thing going on, whereas Beaverbrook, seeing the Yanks on the other side of the border from Canada, knows that they're kind of rapacious capitalists and need to be tamed.
Or at least knows that there's something distinctive about the Commonwealth countries, which is different to the Great Republic of the South, from the Canadian perspective. Yeah, I mean, I think he's interesting because he's reflective of a widespread view amongst many in the Conservative Party, and indeed amongst the Commonwealth, or well, amongst the Empire generally, right? That we need to sort out our arrangements on trade and defence. So, because while Canada and Australia and the different, well, the Dominions and other places have their own, you know, developmental path, we rely on Britain for our defence, and we support Britain in defence, and we while we want to develop our own economy, will be stronger if we're part of a type of customs union, essentially, where it's easier to trade internally between these Commonwealth countries than it is to trade with Europe and with the United States, because they are, well, highly protectionist countries. They are their own trading blocks, and we have an adjustment needs to be made. And Beaverbrook certainly embodies that opinion. That's one shared by people like Rudyard Kipling, people like Joseph Chamberlain in the early 1900s, and so it's his viewpoint is not just a sort of maverick Canadian newspaper, Conrad Black of his career. Although I think he's a different figure, but he's and I don't think that that project is properly understood as well as it should be, right? That what they were trying to achieve. The 1930s is always painted as, you know, the long withdrawing tides, or, you know, useless behavior, and, you know, all as a prelude to Churchill, you know, taking on the Nazis, right?
Yeah, and when actually it is in the 1930s that the British Empire is starting to kind of get closer together economically, particularly through these things called the Ottawa Agreements, and also through the creation of what's known as the Sterling area. And there's an argument that's made during the war, and indeed during the interwar period, that actually, you know, Britain and the Empire does actually quite a lot better than the US in terms of, you know, it's not great getting out of the Depression, but we actually do quite a bit better than the Americans. So it's, you know, this is the argument. Look, you know, it works. We can pull ourselves together. It's worked during the war. We have managed to, you know, unite ourselves much more closely. Look how important the empire has been to Britain. Britain needs to be more imperial minded in the post-war period than it has ever been in the past.
Yeah, and all that was essentially discarded to a certain extent post World War II, because, well, Britain dropped all its tariffs post World War II. I think it basically became what it was in the late 19th century, sort of a unilateral free trade nation again, and any hope of sort of stitching together a grand imperial customs union sort of that fell by the wayside by that stage.
Yeah, I mean, and that's one of the alternatives that could have happened, and it is undermined deliberately by the United States, who do not want to see Britain developing this kind of separate imperial economy, and it's through, Britain's basically broke after the Second World War, and in exchange during the war and afterwards for American financial support, the Americans mandate that Britain dismantle its tariff barriers, and certainly is not allowed to weld the empire any closer.
There's a really interesting discussion, and everything sort of seems obvious in retrospect, or at least it seems like there could have been no alternative in retrospect. But there's a very interesting discussion in your book about Lord Beaverbrook and how he was very focused on preserving the empire, and didn't trust the Americans and didn't trust those outside the empire. And as a result, what type of support should be given to the Soviet Union was seen through that lens. It wasn't. It was seen as, can the Soviets be used to balance the Americans in order to preserve the empire? It wasn't simply, it wasn't simply Winston Churchill style, the English-speaking people and the special relationship, and there was a very different character to the sort of discussions, which I think was probably, it wasn't him. He was a arch capitalist. He wasn't sort of sympathetic to the Soviets on ideological grounds, but it was a sort of great power play, which he thought might have led to a better result than just jumping into the bed with the Americans.
Absolutely. He's a realist when it comes to international relations. That he recognizes that in an anarchic system, powers are going to compete with one another, and he's quite happy to say, look, I don't agree with your internal system, the way it operates, but that's your system. If you don't mess around with what's going on within mine, I won't do the same to yours. And I think in some ways that's why he seems so infuriated with the Americans, who are trying to, he sees it be much more forceful in the way in which they're kind of interjecting in Britain's way of running its economy.
Well, I think that is probably not well appreciated enough. The Americans were not simply this great, big, generous benefactor that needed to be roused from its slumber to get involved in the righteous cause to, get Nazis from Europe. They certainly had their own, could be almost quite mean, right? I mean, in the way that they took the, old British bases, and they weren't forthcoming as quickly as a, old friend would necessarily assume to be.
And Beaverbrook, doesn't really blame them for it in some respects. He's annoyed by it. He's like, they're a great power. This is what great powers do. They try to maximize their influence, and we need to act in the same way. It's completely rational. So if that means getting closer to the Soviets as a way to balance, then so be it. So he's kind of very clear-eyed about this, refreshingly so, I think, in some respects. But it does lead to what's kind of on domestic grounds seems quite bizarre, in that you have this Canadian multi-millionaire newspaper owner taking the raised fist salute from trade unionists and shop floor people, carrying pictures of Stalin down the streets of Birmingham.
No, it's mad. It seemed to be so much more eccentric type of characters back. The further you go back in history, I think we were a bit more bland generally, right, these days. What other myths of that wartime period and what the Conservatives were up to do you think need to be upended or explored further?
Well, I suppose one of them is I think we've touched on it a little bit about the kind of the welfare state, um, um, because there is this sense, and this goes to kind of the heart of the kind of consensus history, is that there's a sense that the type of welfare state that we get during in the post-war period in Britain is developed in kind of in embryo
Mm.
during the Second World War. So you get things like the emergency medical system service, which is meant to be the forerunner to the NHS, which and you get things like uh, free school, free vitamins and free milk for school children. And it's meant to be showing this kind of, fair shares, all in it together, the state providing from its democratic citizens in a universal way. And one of the things I argue in the book is that really wasn't the case, that Britain didn't have a kind of universalist welfare state during the war. It had a warrior welfare state where people in uniform were treated consistently better than those who were out of uniform. And that this was quite a conscious decision, reflecting the realities of a global conflict. Unfortunately, the elderly just didn't really matter all that much in kind of fighting terms during the war, and therefore, not a lot of money was spent on them. But it also ideologically reflected a desire amongst conservatives to develop a more militarized population, a population that was used to bearing arms, used to doing one's duty, willing to take the privations for glory and the greater good.
Yeah, that was the section which I sort of gave me pause a little bit. I couldn't quite see what that would have ultimately resulted in post-war. Some of the other things like the well, Rab Butler, his reforms to education, which happened pre the end of the war, were interesting and seemed to be good ones. But a more militarized Britain, I can't quite get my head around what precisely that would have looked like, or what they were trying to.
Well, I mean, if you think about this in terms of what was happening before the war, there was a great fear that things like cadet organizations were being banned from going into schools. Yeah. And there was a worry about pacifism in Britain and the growth of pacifism. There was a sense amongst some conservatives that this kind of Britain had got soft, and this softness had been one of the things that had led to being unwilling to confront Hitler and the Nazis in the first place. So this is an attempt among some conservatives to create what they see as a slightly tougher country, ready for a world which they see would be, and indeed to turn out to be, highly contested.
Yeah, I just kind of work out whether there's anything beyond the usual grumble by conservative people that the youth aren't as stoic and tough as they once might have been. There is a structural issue though with Britain in this sense. It's an island, and it hasn't historically needed to have such a large land army like the Europeans have, because it's been reliant on its navy and then its air force, and so you haven't had to have such a militarized society in the home country, right? And so you sort of benefited from that, but I can see that over time potentially that might lead to a belief, like potentially exists in some quarters in Australia today and elsewhere, right? That because that war's not going to happen, and we're protected by the American aircraft carriers and this, that, and the other, and so it's not up to us ourselves to be involved and prepared and thinking about wartime stuff. I got a sense reading it that was something that was sort of playing out, and that was where the conservatives were sort of pinpointing their critique, right?
Yeah, and it's also kind of tied into. I mean, it does happen after the Second World War. Britain in peacetime does have national service.
Yeah, right.
into the 1960s, which was something that quite a lot of people had been against before the Second World War. And this is actually something that the Labour Party continues. And if that's a really good example of
Yeah.
the kind of consensus, is that both sides recognise the importance of military preparedness after the war.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's interesting. And so, in Australia, just an Australian angle. I mean, our longest-serving Prime Minister, Robert Gordon Menzies, did head off to the UK in 1941, and was at the War Cabinet, for at least 4 months. Which I think he was criticised for going there, but I think it made a lot of sense, right? You've got to have a seat at the table, and work out exactly, and argue your case there. But it is a long way, and while you're away, all sorts of political machinations went on in Australia, and ultimately he lost his majority, and the Labor Party came to power. There was no national government here. There is some argument, or at least there's been some conjecture, that there were people in the UK that thought that Menzies might be a good replacement for Winston Churchill or something. Do you give any credence to that? I mean,
so yes, there were people who thought that way about Menzies, and saw in Menzies an opportunity, a person to kind of perhaps take the mantle. A great example of the way in which this was an imperial war and not just a national war. The problem is that Menzies never really had that much support, and there were too many people who you needed the support of the Labour Party. Like Churchill was there because the Labour Party would work with him. Whether the Labour Party would have worked with Menzies was very open to question, and there was never really enough criticism of Churchill.
And I don't think there's any hard evidence that Menzies even wanted the role. I think it was just used as sort of, black propaganda against the guy. That, I mean, I'm sure if you'd offered the Prime Ministership of Britain, you'd probably say why not. But I don't think he was really angling for it or over there in the UK for that reason. He was over there to
I don't think he was there for that reason, but I think this is not a particular area of my expertise or on the Menzies element. But there were lots of people at various points in the war who imagined themselves as potential prime ministers, and that things could change. I mean, as they did, like one botched military operation in Norway was one of the things that led Churchill to become premier, and there was a sense that D-Day gone wrong. Had there been more disasters in Africa, he was not universally popular with the party, but there was often this problem of like, well, who's going to replace him, and will that person be acceptable to the other coalition partners? So he ends up kind of staying almost by default sometimes, as well as the genuine support that he did have.
Yeah, I mean, not to go on, but it just was so striking that your political fortunes really did depend a lot on how the war was going, and Churchill had a couple of occasions when he had wins at the right time, whereas actually Menzies, I think, when he was over there, he came back, and then there was the disaster in Greece and Crete, and so he came back at a low ebb, whereas maybe if you come back at a different time, it would have been different. One question I had throughout, I mean, while it's included in your book, Churchill, you don't focus on him, you focus on all the other discussions that were going around him. And I mean, what do you think Winston Churchill's political philosophy really was? I mean, I know it's sort of a high question to summarize, but he did dart around. He was a conservative, then a liberal, and then he was conservative again, and then he was in this national government. He was never elected until in the post-war period by the people as a whole, right? He was just because the Labour Party. Where I mean, he certainly got on with in a nice way with people like Beaverbrook and many others of a different who had a different slant on things. But I feel like he was still at a certain level a liberal at heart, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair summation, and certainly in terms of his economic views, he is a pretty, died in the war free trader in his youth, and he carries on those kind of sympathies into the post-war period. He doesn't necessarily have an issue with the welfare state. He's not the kind of rabid, pro-marketeer of some people's imagination. Although for him, elements of the welfare state that he built up during his time in office in the Edwardian period, things like labour exchanges, was kind of like Centrelink, was about actually making the market work more efficiently. So yeah, in many ways, he kind of retains his kind of liberal sympathies into his later career. I mean, this though, there are other issues that are very important to Churchill. So India, for example, he is a dyed-in-the-wool imperialist, and he believes in the British Empire, and that the British Empire rules best, certainly in India, and doesn't want to see Indian self-governance. So that rather puts him at odds with the direction that the Liberal Party is headed, and much more closer to the Conservatives at that period, well, at least some Conservatives in that period. He's an aristocrat. He's a man of his time and his people. In many ways, he's a paternalist as well. I mean, he does believe that people like him and his class do know best in many ways.
And maybe this is unfair, but economics doesn't seem to have been his great love, right? He was much more interested in the Navy and the grand strategy and the British history, or those types of things, rather than the nickels and dimes and the exchange.
Yeah, I mean, he has a time as Chancellor, and really doesn't enjoy it, and arguably the British economy doesn't enjoy it, him being Chancellor either.
He was on the floor of Wall Street the day of the Great Crash too, right?
Was he? Right? Oh, I didn't know that. That's wonderful.
I think so. I think he always seems to be at the right place at the right time. He's a good little journalist.
I mean, I think the interesting thing about Churchill is that, so my view is that Churchill's interesting. He's fascinating. I mean, we've already, I've already kind of highlighted some of the contradictions of his thought, both wittingly and unwittingly, when it comes to the market and to the state. But in some ways, he's such a big persona that the focus on Churchill really obscures this much wider world of conservative thought that exists during the Second World War. A kind of a world of thought that doesn't necessarily kind of fit into kind of very easy kind of left-right schemes of classification. So, and in some ways, it's because Churchill is understandably very focused on how to win the war, that these people kind of have political space to come up with these ideas and plans for the post-war period, whether it's like creating this much more united empire, some people desperate to kind of go the other way and become hyper free traders, and others kind of interested in a kind of new corporatist world, and some people wanting to kind of go back to almost a kind of pre-modern Merry England.
Yeah, and it's all very interesting. My reading through it, it was certainly a hive of activity, and a lot of the discussions that were had were sort of had in the clubs, and it wasn't as structured as that Beveridge report. So if I'm a voter in 1945 in the UK, I guess I would have thought we've got the Conservative Manifesto, which is fairly it's fairly standard, right? It's not, that doesn't promise anything dramatically. And whereas on the other side, you've got this Beveridge report, and you've got the guys who believe in this program, and all these other ideas that are swirling around are contradictory to the extent the public even knew about them, and they really don't coalesce into a unified program. So if I'm a voter, well, I'm going to go with the guys who actually have something laid out in a way. Is that fair, do you think?
No, that's absolutely fair. I mean, there's some kind of great, lovely document I found for this guy, Rab Butler, who's very much involved in drafting in the Conservative Party during the Second World War and then afterwards, and he's kind of like he's been asked to kind of put together the manifesto with a couple of his chums, and he's just like, well, we don't really agree on anything. So like what we're going to say? Well, we all agree we don't really like nationalisation. Yeah, we'll focus on that. And there's some stuff in the the Conservative kind of propaganda that says, if you don't like this stuff, don't vote for it. I mean, it's really very kind of weak. But I mean, that's a reflection of the fact that a bland manifesto is not a reflection of a lack of thought. It's a reflection in some ways of just too much people that don't agree, because
that's the
point the world is changing.
Yeah, that's one of the key points you make, that there were some great ideas beneath the surface, but they just weren't able to bring them all together under the one roof, as it were. So you've there are other we've only got so much time on it, and there are some other aspects of it, on food policy, which is obviously very important, although and not really thought about enough, and how the food is actually structured, and those types of things. So I'll just direct people to read the book for themselves on those points. But you've recently arrived in Australia. And
yes,
how long have you been here for?
2 years now.
2 years now. Yeah,
still feels recent.
That's right. And so you mentioned the reverence for the NHS is not quite the same as our Medicare. Are there any other differences? And obviously 2 years is a shorter period, that you notice here, which are different to the UK, and those differences can be traced back to 1944, the different paths that we sort of took that period of time. I'm thinking of on the Conservative side here, we tend to say that we didn't have the nationalisation of housing the same way, because Menzies believed in homes and private ownership of houses. It was much more keen on that, and so we had a much larger percentage of the population in Australia who had owned their own house, at least in the 1970s, whereas that wasn't quite the same in the UK. The broader point in Australia, in conservative circles, there tends to be this view that we had the 19th century free market liberal sort of attitudes in Australia, and then we federated, and then it took us until the 1970s to re-emerge as an open trading organization. And the reason why I like your book is it just shows the variety of different intellectual currents which were going on at the time, and the different obviously different parties in the UK and Australia clearly would have been influenced by those schools of thought, because they were reading the same newspapers, and it's not quite as a simple story as people like to tell themselves here in that respect. But yeah, what else have you noticed then, more generally, since coming here with that historian's eye?
So I mean, I suppose weirdly, what do they know of England that only England know? In some ways, being in Australia has actually taught me more about Britain, which maybe not helpful for your viewers and listeners. But I suppose one of the things I've noticed is actually just how much more similar Britain and Australia is now than it was in 1945. And that's partly down to kind of British relative economic decline. Britain and Australia are much more comparable as kind of peer middle powers these days than in 1945. But it's remarkable in many ways, in Britain, particularly since the 1990s, the way that both constitutionally, much more of the British Constitution is now written down, although of course not codified like the Australian one. We now have Britain has, in some respects, kind of much more powerful, devolved administrations in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, with kind of similar-ish levels of power to states. Britain now uses referendums in the same way as Australia has long done. post-Brexit, we've got a similar levels of freedom when it comes to negotiating trade treaties. So I suppose, you know, those, I think structurally Britain and Australia have become a lot more similar, and it's been interesting to see just how, you know, how many Australian policy ideas and rhetoric get picked up in Britain as a result. So, you know, there was obsession during the post-Brexit referendum period with, you know, the idea that we could get Australian-style trading agreements with people, or that we could have our own kind of stop the boats.
An Australian-style immigration point system was the other one.
Oh, yes, the love of the point system. Yeah, so it's been fascinating to me the way in which Australia has, it's almost your kind of policy makers kind of toy box. They kind of, you know, root in Britain, Whitehall, they kind of rootle around and see what has Australia done. So it's interesting, I think, in the way that, you know, perhaps Britain was in many ways an inspiration for, you know, Australian constitutional developments and political developments in much of the 19th century, along with America, lots of other places. It's not just one direction, but how much is now going the other way in the UK.
Yeah, I sometimes feel though that you know, Britain sometimes trying to bring these you know, modern governance systems like devolution, somewhat akin to our states, or referendums, and the like, to the UK on a Supreme Court, aren't necessarily easy to graft on to a country which has a much more sort of ancient system of government. It hasn't had to be designed on in a new place, and so sometimes these sort of things that they've imported from the New World don't work quite as well. But I also think I think you're right. I mean, I think our foreign minister and other people have commented how when the UK was part of the EU, that, you know, it was very hard to have very broad conversations because you couldn't talk about trade very much. You know, you could have some discussions about defense and other type of things, but the reasons for getting together was more, I don't know, like a family catch up rather than having the ability to discuss anything concrete. And there've been those, you know, the names escape me now, but there's obviously been those political pollsters that have helped out different Tory election campaigns, and there's cross-pollination that way. But yeah, sometimes I think it'd be nice if people, just in the interest of, you know, there wasn't so much conformity. Like, try your own thing and see if it works, and we can have a look at it and do your own path. Bringing UK style things here doesn't necessarily work as well as it once did, and vice versa. But we'll see. You know, it's certainly been a lot of UK publications that have come out here in the last couple of years. We get UK, you know, podcasters who come out here, and, you know, and
appalling.
Well, and I was just thinking, why don't we have, you know, not, you know, similar type of guys who are just, you know, audiences in leagues like Konstantin Kisin and the like. There shouldn't be no obvious reason why it doesn't work that way. But anyway, that's a story for another day. So you're out here, and you have a different job related to academia. I'll wrap it up. I mean, but what are the lessons, the enduring lessons that you think we can get from reading a book like yours on the Second World War today?
Well, I suppose I like to think a number. I mean, one of them is that conservatism has historically been very, very varied. That there are lots of different ways to be a conservative, and that as a result, kind of conservatism has a kind of a rich intellectual history. You know, it is far from kind of John Stuart Mill's characterization as the stupid party. So that's one. Many of these ideas that the Conservatives had for the post-war period were deeply radical as well. You know, that conservatism is, they were looking for a blue Jerusalem. They were in many ways kind of utopia, kind of world dreamers. And while conservatism rightly is very historically has been very skeptical of utopias. That hasn't necessarily prevented conservatives at particular times from experimenting and thinking very seriously about the future and thinking very seriously about the kind of future that they want to build. So that'd be a second lesson. But the third one really is all about how kind of malleable and varied the future can be. It's very easy to look back in hindsight and trace a point in time from A to B and to suggest that it was always going to be this way. Britain was always going to have a Labour government after the Second World War. Churchill was always going to lose. We were always going to have a mixed market economy. We were always going to have a welfare state. We were always going to have a Cold War. Actually, individuals matter, and events matter, and the world can change just like that. So you got to be prepared. You got to be prepared. Have your ideas ready to go for that moment.
And in a nice report that can be sold to the public, not too many.
That would help. That would help. Yeah, that would help.
Yeah. No, it's a really interesting subject. I'm actually really glad you're here, because in Australia, and I'll conclude on this note, we don't have a Conservative Party. We have something called the Liberal Party. We have, which is meant to include Conservative, but as a result, I don't think we're quite as focused on that rich tradition and the different schools of thought and precisely what conservatism means in an Australian or New World context. And it's always painted conservatism as something which never really was never really something that took in the Australian political scene, which I think is a misreading, and certainly is not where I believe the future political currents will head. So great to have you on, Kit, and look forward to chatting with you about different things as we go forward and catching up here in this, what I like to call the Athens of the North, Brisbane. Hey, where all the intellectuals from the globe congregate. Yep.
Fantastic.
Great stuff.
Well, thank you so much, Dan. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, mate. Great to make the connection.
Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.